She said it so calmly, like she wasn't cutting 7 years of my life loose. We need a more modern perspective for the next launch. Her voice smooth, detached. My name is Evan Cole, 39 years old, lead gear designer at Summit Track Outfitters in Boulder, Colorado, or at least I was, until that Thursday when Kristen, our new brand director, summoned me to her office. HR rep already seated. The moment I stepped in, I knew. Ever since Kristen took over with her glossy catalog vision, everything I designed, gear built to endure real alpine terrain, had been called dated. She slid the termination letter toward me with a faint smile, her nails gleaming like they'd never scraped against granite or unzipped a bivy sack at midnight. I didn't argue, just nodded, packed up my sketchbooks, my tablet, my principles. 7 years, gone in under 7 minutes. What she didn't know? I'd been building something outside those walls, designs they called too unconventional, too niche, designs I still believed in. On the drive home, I got a message from Marcus in logistics. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I didn't respond, just gripped the wheel tighter. If this moment resonates with you, if you've ever been cast aside for staying true to your vision, tap like, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember that real value doesn't go out of style. I grew up in Jackson Hole, where my grandfather built handcrafted wooden kayaks in a shed that always smelled of cedar and linseed oil. That's where I first understood what real design meant. No gimmicks, no frills, just clean, honest craftsmanship, form born from function. He used to say, every curve has a reason. Every edge tells you something. I carried that with me through design school, through every prototype and failed sketch, into every decision I made at Summit Track. When I first joined the company, they were floundering, durable products, but with all the charm of a military surplus store. My work helped rebuild their identity from the ground up. We started earning trust from climbers, backcountry guides, even veterans. People who depended on their gear not to fail. That version of the company, the one that understood real performance, was gone now, replaced by something shinier, louder, but hollow. That afternoon, I sat in my studio apartment, quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. I unrolled the rejected concepts I'd been quietly collecting, each one a solution to a problem someone out there still had. Kristen hadn't wanted them. But I wasn't designing for her. I was still designing for the people in the field, the ones who knew the difference. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in like frost on glass. One day it was a marketing meeting focused on weight distribution and tensile strength. And the next, it was mood boards and trend forecasts. When Kristen came in from a luxury apparel brand in San Francisco, she brought a wave of surface-level shine that slowly drowned out the purpose-driven ethos we'd built. I watched as fresh graduates with sleek portfolios and zero field time were handed flagship projects. My proposals, quietly redirected to the archive. The new creative direction favored aesthetic over endurance. Gear that looked great in filtered photos, but fell apart in unpredictable terrain. 3 months before I was let go, I submitted a collection of adaptive weatherproof systems. Designs rooted in field interviews, performance data, and months of iterative testing. Kristen called them uninspired. A week later, she presented concepts almost identical to mine to the executive team, credited to Liam, a recent hire from a boutique European brand. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But I started asking myself harder questions. What did it mean when the mission changed, but the name stayed the same? And how long could I keep compromising the kind of work I knew mattered, just to survive in a place that no longer saw its value? The answer was becoming painfully clear. That night, I called Jonas, an old friend and materials engineer who'd moved to Timberline Equipment, Summit Track's biggest competitor. We hadn't talked in months, but he picked up after the second ring. "What's going on, Evan?" I told him everything. Kristen, the firing, the stolen concepts, the gut punch of watching my ideas paraded around under someone else's name. There was a pause on the line, then a question. "You under a non-compete?" Number the old CEO, Martin, never believed in them. Said good ideas don't need chains to keep them. Jonas went quiet. Interesting, very interesting. He asked if I still had my sketches. I told him I had 12 collections, fully rendered and annotated. Silence again. Then, "I'll talk to Leah, our creative director. She's not into politics, she's into results." The call ended without promises, but I felt something shift. Not hope exactly. Something quieter, sturdier, like traction. The next morning, as rain pattered against the windows, I sat at my drafting table and began refining 6 of my strongest designs. Not changing the heart of them, just sharpening the presentation, reframing them for someone who might actually see. That night, I hit send. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. By the time I opened my eyes the next morning, there was already a message waiting. From Leah Chambers, subject, 10 a.m. My office, bring contract terms. I stared at the screen for a moment, heart thudding with something dangerously close to belief. I didn't waste time. Threw on my field jacket, boots scuffed from years of actual terrain testing, not a showroom, and drove across town to Timberline Equipment's headquarters. The receptionist barely had time to ask my name before I was ushered straight in. Leah's office wasn't polished like Kristen's. It was filled with prototype packs, half-disassembled gear, coffee stains on blueprints. It felt like a place where real work happened. She didn't bother with pleasantries, just pointed to the corkboard behind her. Pinned there were all 6 of my submitted designs. "These solve problems we've been stuck on for 2 seasons, she said, tapping one in the center. A modular insulation system that adapted to rapid weather shifts without sacrificing mobility. "How soon can you start?" "I'm available now." She nodded once. "Good. We're moving fast." I stood there for a moment, caught in the quiet realization that someone, finally, saw what I'd been trying to do all along. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slip through my hands. 1 week into my new role at Timberline, I got a call from Derek, Summit Track's longtime production lead. We'd worked side by side for years, solving material bottlenecks, refining specs until everything clicked. His voice was low. "Evan, this is off the record. Things are unraveling here. Liam's designs look sleek in mock-ups, but they're a nightmare to produce. Materials don't flex the way he assumes. And the prototypes? 2 pounds over target weight." I leaned back in my chair, jaw tight. Not my problem anymore. It wasn't done. "Kristen told execs you left the team without proper documentation. She's claiming you sabotaged the handoff." My stomach turned. That wasn't just a lie, it was personal. I'd left everything clean, shared files, trained Liam myself, even when it hurt. That night, I drafted a calm, direct email to Victor, Summit Track's CEO. Just a meeting request. He agreed to coffee the next morning. We met at a busy cafe downtown. He arrived late, checking his watch like I'd already wasted his time. I kept my voice steady. "I've heard claims I withheld documentation. That's false. Everything was archived on the shared drive. Liam was walked through the system." Victor's expression didn't shift. "Kristen said you might get defensive." "Number, I'm being clear." He nodded slowly. This industry's small. I'd hate to see your reputation affected. Thinly veiled, a warning cloaked as concern. As I walked out, my phone buzzed. An email from Leah. Subject, let's move. Summit Series, go. Kristen had made her choice. Now it was my turn. 2 days later, Jonas invited me to grab lunch at a diner far from either company's HQ. He slid his tablet across the table after we ordered. You need to see this. It was an internal marketing brief from Summit Track, somehow leaked. I scrolled through the slides and stopped cold. There they were, my designs. Not inspired by, not similar to. Mine. Layouts, features, even the adaptive sleeve joint I'd prototyped in my garage. All now rebranded as the Altitude Series, with Liam's name listed as lead designer. I stared at the images. Kristen hadn't just buried my work. She'd waited long enough to try and claim it. They're planning full launch in September, Jonas said quietly. Already ordering materials. I sat back, heart pounding, not in fear, but in pure clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done mourning what was lost. And here's the kicker, Jonas added, pulling up a second document. Leah convinced Timberline's leadership to move your line up. They're fast-tracking it for an August release. 1 month earlier, I looked down at the mock-ups, then at the contract notes I'd scribbled in my pocket notebook. Let's do it, I said. No hesitation, no second guessing. That night, I called Leah and gave her the green light. If Summit Track wanted a showdown, they'd get one. Only this time, on terrain, I knew better than anyone. I sat alone in the Timberline guest office, contract folder unopened on the desk. Outside, the machines hummed, teams moved, ideas lived. But inside me, stillness and doubt. Kristen's voice echoed, uninvited. Your work isn't aligned with where the market is going. We need innovation that photographs well. Don't take this personally, Evan. I exhaled slowly and looked down at the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed at Summit Track 5 years ago. It had expired long ago. But the weight of them, still lingered in my bones like damp air in a tent after a storm. The Timberline contract sat in front of me, royalties, creative control, real authorship. Everything I had fought for, but never received. And still, my hand hovered above the pen, unmoving. Was I really free? Or just carrying the chains differently? I reached into my old sketchbook, one I hadn't opened since the day I was terminated, and pulled out a folded page. It was the first modular shell concept I ever drew. The lines were uneven, my notes were messy. But the idea was pure, unfiltered. Without a word, I stood, walked to the small trash bin in the corner, and tore the expired Summit Track NDA in half, then again and again, until it was nothing but paper scraps. Then I returned to the table and signed. 2 days later, I signed the paperwork at Timberline's headquarters. The contract was unlike anything I'd ever seen at Summit Track. Royalties per unit sold, full creative control over production specs, and my name featured in the launch campaign. We're calling it the Summit Series, Leah told me, her voice steady but excited. And yes, we want your name on every hang tag. When I handed over my full design files, they weren't just rough concepts. Each one included layered schematics, materials lists, stress test data, and scaled manufacturing plans. I'd built them for real use, not runway slideshows. Later that evening, as I reviewed tech pack updates from the team, an email landed in my personal inbox. From Kristen Alden, subject, consulting opportunity. Evan, I hope you're well. I was reviewing our upcoming collections and realized we might benefit from your expertise in a short-term consulting role. Would you be open to a discussion? No apology. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just a vague attempt to pull me back into something she no longer controlled. I stared at the message for a moment, then quietly deleted it. No response. No explanation. She'd already made her decision. Now I was making mine. The next morning, I stepped into Timberline's manufacturing facility. An open, humming space filled with rolls of fabric, test rigs, and the quiet rhythm of people building real things. It smelled like heat-pressed nylon and focused ambition. The production team looked skeptical at first. I wasn't some outsider consultant in polished shoes. I wore the same worn boots I'd hiked the Tetons in. By noon, I was at the table with their lead engineer, Diane, reviewing load points on the modular backpack system. After an hour, she pulled me aside. "These designs are brilliant," she said, "but they're complex as hell. If we're serious about hitting this August deadline, I'll need you in this facility. Every single day." I nodded. Whatever it takes. And I meant it. For the next 4 weeks, I was the first one in and the last to leave. Twice, I crashed on a folding cot in the corner office after late-night waterproofing tests. I ate vending machine dinners. My back ached. My hands cracked. But every adjustment, every material swap, brought us closer to launch. And something else was happening. Respect. These weren't just engineers anymore. They were collaborators. Builders who saw what I was trying to do. Unlike Kristen, I didn't dismiss their concerns. I listened. We solved problems together. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. A week into production, I got a letter. Certified. Heavy with legal implication. Summit Track's legal department was reviewing my employment history for potential confidentiality violations. No direct accusation. Just carefully worded suspicion. I brought the letter straight to Leah, who didn't flinch. She handed it to Timberline's legal team. After reading it, their counsel smiled without humor. "Standard intimidation play," she said. "They've got no case. Your designs were formally rejected. You have timestamps, documentation, submission records, and no non-compete clause." "Should I respond?" I asked. She shook her head. "We'll handle it." That evening, Timberline's lawyers issued a single-page reply. "We have extensive documentation of Mr. Cole's original designs, including submission dates and internal feedback logs from your team. Should this escalate, we welcome the opportunity to compare your current product roadmap to his rejected work, under oath." 2 days later, silence. Then a call from Derek. "What the hell did you do?" he asked, half whispering. Kristen had a closed-door meeting with legal. She walked out pale, shaking. I didn't answer. Just sat in the Timberline break room, staring at the production board filled with names, specs, and launch dates. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. Proof that the work I believed in wasn't just valid. It was unstoppable. 2 days later, Jonas called again. "Lunch. You need to see something." We met at a quiet burger joint tucked behind an old climbing shop. He slid his tablet across the table without a word. It was Summit Track's internal fall launch brief. Mock-ups, campaign assets, production schedules. I scrolled and froze. There, stamped with clean branding and Liam's name, were my designs. Not inspired, not adjusted. Mine, line for line. She hadn't just stolen the work. She'd buried it, rewrapped it, and handed it to someone else like it had never passed through my hands. "They're calling it the Altitude Series," Jonas said, his voice low. Full push, national rollout. They've even ordered production materials. I sat back, pulse steady but ice cold. She planned this, I said. All of it. Jonas nodded. But Leah's not playing defense. She's convinced Timberline's CEO to fast-track your collection. We can have the Summit series in stores a full month ahead of Summit Track's launch. I didn't even hesitate. This is the moment, he said, meeting my eyes. Once we greenlight production, it's locked in. Good, I said. Lock it in. The game wasn't just on. It was already shifting, and this time, I had the lead. The last week of July, whispers started circulating through the outdoor gear industry. Retailers were buzzing. Forums lit up with speculation. Timberline had never released a collection like this before. Modular, adaptive, gear-first design that felt like it came from someone who used the products, not just drew them. Then the preview catalog dropped. My name, Evan Cole, printed clearly beneath each product in the Summit series. Not creative team, not design department. Me. 2 days later, Derek called again. Evan, did you... Never mind, I shouldn't be asking, but... It's brilliant. Kristen's in full meltdown. She's telling the board you somehow stole Altitude's thunder. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He continued. But the funny thing is, we all know. We all know those were your designs. And now your name is right there for everyone to see. I stood by the Timberline display board that afternoon, where Leah had pinned the first glossy product shots. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like restoration. All I'd ever wanted was to build tools that mattered and have the work credited to the right hands. Now, that was finally happening. 3 days after the Summit series went live, Outside Review ran a feature article. Separated at birth. Curious case of two nearly identical outdoor collections. Side-by-side images compared Timberline's Summit gear and Summit Track's unreleased Altitude line. No outright accusation, just a pointed analysis of timelines, design language, and one glaring fact. Both lines originated from the same name. Mine. Online forums exploded. Designers I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Industry veterans started sharing archived award photos and old Summit Track press releases, all linking my name to the innovations now credited to Liam. Kristen stayed silent, but her silence screamed. The next day, my phone buzzed. Vivian, Summit Track's executive VP. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was clipped. Evan, this is unacceptable. You've deliberately undermined our company and exposed internal designs. I called her back, calmly. I designed gear for the company that hired me to do so. What you're selling now under someone else's name? I have emails, time-stamped sketches, formal rejections. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said more softly, You should have stayed. I looked out the window of Timberline's office, where prototypes of the Summit series lined the display wall. No, I replied. You should have valued what you had. A week later, Summit Track quietly announced they were postponing the Altitude series for additional refinement. No press conference, no explanation, just a sentence buried at the bottom of a newsletter. But the industry understood exactly what that meant. By October, Timberline's Summit series had shattered the company's Q1 records. Orders flooded in faster than logistics could keep up. Retailers doubled and tripled their requests. Gear reviewers called it a return to purpose-built design. My first royalty check arrived 2 weeks later, already larger than my entire annual salary at Summit Track. Leah called me into her office with a smile. It's time, she said. You're now director of design. We want you leading the next 3 seasonal collections. She handed me a keycard to the private studio upstairs, windows facing the mountains. 2 days later, Jonas walked into my new workspace carrying a box. "Guess what?" he said, grinning. "They approved my transfer. I'm your new materials lead." I laughed, genuinely this time. Not out of relief, but momentum. Summit Track would go on, sure. Eventually, they'd release a watered-down version of something that once had teeth. The reviews were tepid. Sales were flat. Their stock dipped 8% that quarter. But I didn't track it too closely anymore. I had my own mountain to build, and this time, no one was standing in the way. Winter came fast that year. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside the Denver Outdoor Innovation Conference, where industry leaders gathered to showcase the future. I wasn't presenting, just observing, watching where things were heading now that the noise had settled. That's when I saw her. Kristen, alone at the bar, fingers wrapped around a half-finished cocktail, her name badge half hidden beneath a folded scarf. She looked up as I passed. "Congratulations on your success," she said, voice cool, practiced. I nodded. "Thank you." "You could have stayed," she added, eyes searching mine. "You could have fought harder for your design, didn't you?" I paused, not out of hesitation, but consideration. "Some places," I said softly, "don't deserve the fight." She blinked just once. A flicker of something behind her professional mask, regret maybe, or just recognition. Then she straightened her posture, like she hadn't felt it at all. "Vivian's stepping down next month," she offered. "The board asked me to serve as interim." I almost felt something like sympathy. Almost. "Good luck," I said. And I meant it. The industry didn't need more losses. It needed leadership grounded in truth. Then I turned and walked away, toward a future no longer tied to old names, but built on new foundations I laid myself. 6 months later, a plain cardboard package arrived at my door. No return label, no note on the outside. Inside were my old sketchbooks, the ones I thought I'd never see again. The covers were smudged, corners curled, but every page was intact. Designs, concepts, field notes. At the bottom was a folded envelope, handwritten. "Evan. These belong to you? Kristen's gone. Just thought you should know." "Derek," I stood in the doorway. The box cradled in my arms, memories pressing up from every page. Ideas that never saw the light at Summit Track. Some half-formed, others fully realized, but shelved for not being marketable. One sketch in particular caught my eye. A modular tent system built for alpine environments, drawn during a solo hike 3 winters ago. I'd never pitched it, not to anyone. Kristen would have dismissed it on sight. That evening, I sat at my drafting table, new studio, new skyline, and reopened the page. Adjusted a few lines, annotated the ventilation layout, tweaked the anchor points for faster deployment in ice conditions. Then I called Leah. "I think I've got something for our winter collection," I said. And just like that, I wasn't just moving forward. I was building what came next. On my terms. Spring brought a new energy to the studio. Timberline's stock had doubled since the Summit Series launch. My team had grown. We were already prototyping the winter line, refining gear that solved real problems for real people. Some nights, when the building was quiet and the city lights flickered below, I'd sit by the wide windows and open one of my old sketchbooks. Not out of nostalgia, but clarity. I thought back to my years at Summit Track, the late nights, the field tests, the meetings where I fought to be heard. I used to carry bitterness for how it ended, for how Kristen twisted my work and tried to bury it. But now I saw the full picture. They didn't silence my voice, they amplified it. Their rejection pushed me toward something more honest, more aligned. The truth was, I didn't win by proving them wrong. I won by building something better, something lasting. Design, at its core, isn't about trends or approval. It's about function, integrity, solving the kinds of problems that still matter when the applause fades. That's what endures. And that's what I was always meant to do.